The forest was once a retreat, a place of quiet serenity, but now it feels like a living nightmare. As the rain pelts down, soaking everything in its path, one lone hiker stumbles deeper into the woods, his mind fraying with every step. His flashlight flickers, casting shadows that twist unnaturally among the trees, and every rustle in the underbrush raises his heartbeat. What started as a simple hike has become a descent into madness, with the very forest closing in around him. Every crack of twigs, every whisper in the wind, reminds him that something else is watching, waiting. He's not alone, and whatever is hunting him is drawing closer. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper, almost like a distant call that seemed to echo in the vastness of the dark forest. Every step taken by the lone camper felt heavier, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He tried to keep his bearings, but the towering trees around him, each one more ancient than the last, seemed to bend inward, their gnarled branches twisting like dark hands reaching out, waiting to pull him deeper into the woods. The night had crept in quickly, and the moon, barely visible through the canopy, cast long, jagged shadows across the ground. His flashlight, weak and flickering, barely illuminated the path in front of him. The woods were oppressive, alive with an unsettling stillness that made every crunch of his boots against the dirt sound deafening. He glanced behind him, but only the impenetrable darkness stared back. He had lost his group hours ago, had wandered off in pursuit of what, he wasn't even sure. It had started as an innocent hike, a break from the daily grind, the promise of clear skies and fresh air. But somewhere, after taking that wrong turn, things had started to feel off. The forest had never seemed so vast, so endless. No matter how far he walked, the trees were the same, just as thick, just as endless. He had called out to his friends when he first realized he was alone, but his voice had only been swallowed by the silence. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he tried to ignore the sense of being watched. The kind of feeling you get when you're the last one in a room, when every creak of the floorboard, every shift of the air around you, feels just a little too deliberate. There was something out there, he was sure of it. Something in the shadows, in the spaces just outside the light of his flickering beam. The trees stretched upward like the bones of ancient giants, their thick trunks gnarled and twisted, as if they had seen far too much in their time. It was a forest that felt like it had lived longer than he could even comprehend, one that held secrets not meant for human eyes. His mind was beginning to play tricks on him. Was that the sound of footsteps? He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained his ears, but heard nothing but the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Maybe it was just the wind, or the tension building inside him, playing on his nerves. Still, the sensation of being watched wouldn't go away. He tried to shake it off, but every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig felt amplified. His flashlight flickered again, casting long, erratic shadows on the path ahead. His hand, slick with sweat, tightened around the handle. He pushed forward, telling himself to stay calm, to keep going. He had to find his friends, had to make his way back to the campsite. It was only a mile or two away, he knew that. But the more he walked, the more it felt like he was going in circles, retracing his steps over and over. The light from his flashlight caught something, an old, weathered sign, half buried beneath a pile of fallen leaves. He bent down to get a closer look, brushing the leaves aside with trembling hands. The letters were faded, but he could still make out the word, forbidden. Below it, almost too faint to read, was another word, but he couldn't make it out. His fingers trembled as he traced the rough edges of the sign, a chill creeping up his spine. What was this place? What was it doing in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep inside these woods? The breeze shifted, colder now, as if the air itself had turned against him. He stood up, wiping the dirt off his hands, his mind racing. It was a warning, he realized. A warning that he should have seen before. He turned around, his eyes scanning the woods around him, desperate for any sign of life. There was nothing. Just the trees, the same as before, the same oppressive silence. But that was when he heard it again. The whispers. At first, it was too faint to make out, a low, guttural sound that could have easily been the wind. But then it came again, A string of unintelligible words, like a chant or a murmur from some unseen presence. His heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, his flashlight casting frantic beams through the thick underbrush. There was no one there, no one at all. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct, as if the very forest itself was speaking to him. His breath hitched in his throat, and his body froze in place. The whispers felt like they were coming from every direction, surrounding him, closing in on him. He couldn't tell if they were voices or if it was just his mind unraveling from the isolation, but either way, they were unmistakable. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root, sending him sprawling to the ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, tumbling through the air before landing with a dull thud. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, something moved. A shadow flickered just at the edge of his vision. He whipped his head around, his heart slamming against his ribcage. There was no time to think, no time to process what was happening. He scrambled to his feet, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the trees moving, bending unnaturally. He was disoriented, dizzy from the sudden sense of wrongness. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that clawed at his mind, gnawing at his sanity. He covered his ears, but it didn't help. The darkness was closing in around him. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, barely visible through the trees, but as he blinked, it came into focus, a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow black eyes staring directly at him. The figure moved toward him slowly, almost gliding over the forest floor, its movements unnatural, jerky, like it was not quite human. A low growl rumbled from its throat, a sound so deep and guttural that it sent a tremor through his entire body. Panic surged through him. His legs moved before his brain had even caught up, but it felt like the forest was actively working against him. His feet tangled in the undergrowth, his heart pounded in his chest, and all he could think was to run, to get away from whatever that thing was. But as he ran, the figure followed, its growl getting louder, closer. He could hear its breath now, sharp and ragged, and every instinct in his body screamed to flee, but the path ahead of him was disappearing. The trees closed in, the space around him growing smaller and smaller, until it felt as though he was running through a tunnel made of bark and shadow. With every turn, every desperate step, the thing behind him seemed to get closer. He dared a glance over his shoulder, just once, and there it was, right behind him, its fingers, clawed and elongated, reaching out toward him. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque, inhuman grin, its teeth too sharp to be anything of this world. His breath caught in his throat, and he pushed himself harder, faster, but his legs felt like lead. His lungs burned. There was no escape. He could hear the thing now, its breath hot against his neck. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. The earth seemed to collapse in on itself, and before he could even process what was happening, he was falling into darkness. The last thing he heard was the figure's voice, a deep, rasping whisper, "You shouldn't have been here." And then, everything went black. The group had been walking for hours, the dense forest wrapping around them like an impenetrable wall, each step making the air feel thicker, heavier. They had set out on this trail in good spirits, for friends eager to explore the wilderness for the weekend. The sun had barely touched the horizon when they first set out, the cool morning air smelling of pine and earth, but now, as the day waned, the atmosphere seemed to change, darker, colder. At first, they joked about the twists and turns in the path, pointing out the strange patterns in the trees or the way the underbrush had grown unnaturally thick. But now, as the shadows stretched longer and the light began to fade, their jokes had quieted into uneasy silence. It was almost as if the forest itself was shifting, as if it were slowly closing in on them. The familiar crunch of their boots on the forest floor now seemed too loud, echoing off the trees. "What time is it?" Jenna asked, glancing nervously at her phone. The screen flickered weakly, indicating it was almost dead. 2:30, replied Eric, glancing at his own wristwatch, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "That doesn't make sense," Jenna murmured, her brow furrowing. "We've only been walking for 5 hours, interrupted Mark, pulling up beside her, his face a picture of concern. "I know. We should have hit the campsite by now. The conversation trailed off as the group continued to walk, the path ahead seeming to stretch endlessly, winding through the trees, as though it led nowhere at all. The forest, which had once seemed so beautiful, was now taking on a sinister quality, its towering trees blocking out the sky, casting everything below them in a perpetual twilight. It felt wrong, unnatural. I swear, we've passed this tree before, Jenna said, halting suddenly. What? Mark looked around, his voice full of skepticism. I swear, this exact tree, Jenna pointed to a massive pine that loomed ahead, its trunk covered in strange, knot-like patterns. I noticed it the first time we passed. It's too familiar. Eric sighed, his exhaustion starting to show. Jenna, we're lost. Let's not make things worse by overthinking it, all right? But even as he said it, his voice faltered. Something didn't sit right with him either. The air felt different now, charged with an unsettling energy. The light around them had shifted from warm and inviting to something colder, grayer. The birds had stopped chirping. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, unnerving in its quietness. Jenna's pulse quickened as she stared at the tree, her intuition screaming at her. This isn't normal. Something's wrong here. Can we just focus on getting out of here? Eric snapped, clearly frustrated. He started walking ahead, his pace quickening. Mark and Jenna exchanged a look but followed him silently, their minds racing. The path continued to wind deeper into the forest, and with each step, they seemed to venture farther away from any semblance of safety. The trees had become thicker, the underbrush more tangled. The forest felt increasingly suffocating, and the deeper they went, the more the light faded, as if it was being consumed by the darkness that loomed ahead. It was as though the woods had grown hostile, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that was almost palpable, like a presence, an ancient force watching their every move. Eric led the group, his steps heavy, his breathing shallow as he tried to push forward. But the harder he tried, the more the forest seemed to push back. They had been walking for what felt like hours more, yet the path remained stubbornly unchanged. There was no end in sight, no clearing, no sign of their campsite. It was as though the woods had swallowed them whole, and they had become trapped in some endless loop. I don't understand, Eric muttered, his voice breaking as he stopped, running his hand through his hair. We should have reached the campsite by now. Mark scanned the area around them, his eyes darting between the trees. We've got to be close. Let's just keep moving. But even as he spoke, he knew something was wrong. The trees had become denser, and the shadows stretched longer. The familiar warmth of the sun had long since disappeared, replaced by an eerie chill that seemed to seep into their bones. It felt like the forest had grown heavier, its silence more oppressive with each passing second. Jenna, always the most practical of the group, pulled out her phone again, her hands trembling as she tried to unlock the screen. The low battery warning flashed again, but she tried anyway, hoping for some sign of a signal. Nothing. Her heart sank. Nothing. No bars, no GPS. We're completely cut off. Great, Eric muttered under his breath, kicking at the dirt in frustration. He looked up at the sky, but the canopy of trees above was too thick to see anything. We're lost, Mark said, his voice tinged with dread. And we're running out of daylight. A silence fell between them. They all knew it was true, but none of them wanted to say it out loud. The realization settled in their stomachs like a cold stone. The forest had swallowed them, and they had no way of finding their way out. Jenna's eyes darted to the trees around them. They seemed different now, more twisted, more menacing. The once innocent forest that had seemed like an escape from their daily lives had become something else entirely, something unnatural. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, a sense of being watched creeping over her. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Mark had stopped walking, his eyes scanning the woods, his body stiff with tension. What the hell was that? Mark asked suddenly, his voice sharp. They all froze. The sound had come from deeper within the trees, just beyond the reach of their faint flashlight beams. It was a rustling, a shuffling noise, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. I don't know, Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. But we need to get out of here. Eric, ever the leader, glanced around, trying to make sense of it all. His mind raced, but nothing about this situation made sense. Maybe it's just an animal, he said, though even as he said it, he didn't believe it. But the longer they stood there, the more it felt like the forest was alive. Alive and watching them, a predator moving silently, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Another noise, closer this time. A snap of twigs. It wasn't just an animal. Something was out there. Keep moving, Eric said, his voice urgent. His pulse was racing now, fear mingling with his growing sense of panic. We need to get back to the trail. But no matter how fast they walked, it felt as though the path stretched on forever. The shadows deepened, the trees crowded in on them, and the forest seemed to whisper its secrets, dark, forgotten stories that had no place in the light. They were no longer just lost. They were being hunted. As they trudged forward, the sounds behind them grew louder, clearer, unmistakable now. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with their every step. It wasn't just the forest anymore. Something else was here, something waiting, something that had been following them all along. The pressure of the air, thick with tension, made it harder to breathe. They weren't alone, and whatever was behind them, it wasn't going to let them leave. The rain had started in the early hours of the evening, light at first, as if testing the earth below, but it quickly turned heavier, an oppressive downpour that seemed to soak everything in its path. The hiker, drenched and shivering, had been trying to find shelter for what felt like hours. The forest, once a beautiful expanse of green, had become an alien, hostile place. The trees now loomed like dark sentinels, their thick branches sagging under the weight of the rain, casting long, strange shadows across the path. It was hard to tell if it was the shadows that made the forest feel unnervingly eerie, or the silence that seemed to stretch out before him, broken only by the sound of his boots squelching through the mud. He could feel his exhaustion in his bones, the weight of the day's hike pressing on him, his muscles sore from the uphill climb, the endless twists and turns of the trail. He hadn't meant to get lost. The map he had seemed so straightforward, but the forest had its own plans. The more he tried to retrace his steps, the more the path seemed to change. Every direction led to a deeper, darker corner of the woods. Each time he thought he recognized a landmark, it faded into the endless rows of trees, leaving him feeling more and more trapped. The rain now poured in sheets, cold and unrelenting, drenching him to the skin. He pulled the hood of his jacket tighter around his face, trying to shield himself from the constant downpour, but it felt useless. The wetness seeped through the fabric, clinging to his clothes, and the cold seemed to gnaw at him from the inside. There was nothing around him but the thick, impenetrable forest. No path, no sign of civilization. He had no idea where he was, and worse still, no idea which way to go to find his camp. He tried to keep his focus, but the pressure of the storm was unbearable. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, trying to rationalize the situation. But the longer he stayed in the forest, the less everything seemed to make sense. The trees were too tall, too close, and the branches, thick with rain, created a canopy that blocked the already dim light from the sky. It was as if the forest was actively trying to obscure his view, as though it didn't want him to see what was beyond it. Then out of nowhere he heard it, a whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind, the soft rustling of the leaves, but it came again, this time louder, clearer. A low murmur, almost like a chant, but in a language he couldn't understand. His heart skipped a beat, and he froze, straining to hear through the cacophony of rain. The whispering continued, coming from deeper in the forest, further from the trail. His first instinct was to brush it off as his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, the forest was full of strange sounds, the rustling of animals, the groaning of the trees, but the sound persisted. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone, or something, was out there, and they were calling to him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His stomach twisted in an uneasy knot. He wasn't sure whether he should feel frightened or intrigued, but the feeling of being watched had grown unbearable. His feet shifted nervously, and he found himself scanning the trees around him, the flashlight weak in his hand as it trembled from his own unease. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, and the air, thick with humidity, felt charged, as though the storm wasn't the only thing brewing in the air. "Hello." His voice cracked through the silence, a shout into the storm. It was a stupid thing to do, but the words left his mouth before he could stop them. He immediately regretted it. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, there was nothing. Not a sound, not a movement. Then, from deep within the trees, a rustling noise. He turned, his flashlight darting back and forth in a panic. The trees ahead were still and silent, the shadows unmoving, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was out there. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just some animal, some lost hiker like him. No, there was something deliberate in the movement, something calculated. The rustling didn't fade away as he hoped. Instead, it grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was circling around him, like he was being stalked. The hiker stood still, straining to hear, to see something, anything, that might explain what was happening. His breathing came faster, and the cold air around him began to burn as it entered his lungs. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was deafening. His feet moved without thinking, his instincts pushing him forward, away from whatever was out there, but the forest seemed to close in on him. The trees pressed tighter together, the shadows thickened, and even the rain seemed to fade into the background as the world around him shrank, became more oppressive. His heart raced, his breath coming in shallow bursts, but still, there was nothing, no explanation, no sign of movement. And yet, he knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the cold sense of dread creeping over him like a second skin. The air was still now, too still, and it carried with it a suffocating weight, as though the entire forest had turned its attention to him. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel eyes on him, dark, cold eyes. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The whispers returned then, but this time, they were different. They weren't soft murmurs anymore. They were clear, direct, and the words, they felt wrong. They were close now, so close, and they felt like they were inside his head, twisting, turning, breaking through his thoughts. He tried to drown them out, tried to focus, but the more he tried, the louder they became. The words, they weren't in any language he knew. They were an echo of something ancient, something forgotten, like a warning. A promise. Suddenly, a crack in the trees to his left. A shadow flitted across his vision, too quick, too fleeting to fully make out, but it was there. It was real. He whipped his head around, his flashlight darting in the direction of the movement. But there was nothing. The trees stood silent. The forest was still again. His feet were moving now, faster than before, driven by fear, driven by the primal instinct to run. His legs felt like lead, heavy, uncooperative, but he pushed himself forward. His breath was ragged, his chest tight with each painful gasp. The rain pounded harder, a torrent of cold against his skin, but still he ran. He had to get away. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching him, it was coming closer, and he had no way of knowing how far it had followed him. The forest had swallowed him, and now it was closing in for good. The whispers were back, louder than ever, wrapping themselves around his thoughts like tendrils, dragging him down into something dark, something ancient. And no matter how fast he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, he couldn't outrun them. The trees began to blur, the ground beneath his feet softening into mud, but still, he couldn't stop. His eyes burned with the effort to keep them open, but everything around him was shifting, changing. The world had tilted on its axis, and he was falling into something he couldn't see but could feel all too clearly. A presence, a force, a dark weight that pressed against his chest. And then, through the storm, through the whispers, there was another sound. Closer now. Not the rustling of leaves. Not the chant that had once seemed so distant. No, this was different. It was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing through the stillness of the forest, moving closer. They were coming for him, and this time, there would be no escape. The cold morning air hung heavy as the group of friends trudged along the damp forest path, their breath visible in the crisp air. They had been searching for hours, calling out, looking for any sign of their missing friend. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn of the trail revealing nothing but more trees, more underbrush, more shadows. Their voices had faded long ago, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. At first, they had hoped it was just a simple mix-up, that their friend had wandered off to find water or explore a bit further, but as the hours dragged on and the daylight began to dim, their worry turned into dread. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to keep his breathing steady. "We need to split up," he suggested, his voice tight with anxiety. He had tried to stay calm, to keep it together for the others, but now, with the sun setting and no sign of their friend, his nerves were fraying at the edges. "We'll cover more ground that way." Jenna, who had been silent for some time, looked at him with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Split up? Mark, we're already lost. We shouldn't be wandering off even further into the woods. It's getting dark. It's too dangerous." Eric, who had been walking ahead, paused and turned to face them, his face pale. "Jenna's right," he said, his voice low. "We stay together. If we split up, who knows what might happen? We'll just get more lost." There was a long silence as they all stood there, the weight of their situation sinking in. The forest, once a beautiful escape, now felt like a trap. It felt as though it was closing in on them, pressing in from all sides. The trees towered above, blocking out what little light was left. The air felt thick, heavy with the growing sense of something wrong. Mark shook his head, his frustration mounting. "We have to find her. She could be out here somewhere, hurt or worse." "Shoo," Jenna interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. She held up her hand, signaling for the others to stop. "Did you hear that?" They fell silent, straining their ears. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above, but there was something else. A low sound, almost imperceptible, but distinct in the stillness of the forest. It was faint at first, like a distant cry, but as they listened more closely, it became clearer, a scream, sharp and desperate, cutting through the air. All three of them froze, their hearts racing in unison. "Did you hear that?" Eric asked, his voice trembling with fear. Jenna nodded, her face pale. It sounded like her." Without another word, the group turned, instinctively following the direction of the sound. The dense trees seemed to block their path, their branches reaching out as if trying to hold them back. The rain, which had started to fall again, turned the path slippery, but they pushed forward, adrenaline fueling their movements. The faint scream echoed again, clearer this time, and it made their blood run cold. It was a sound of pure terror, a sound that sent chills down their spines. They were closer now, the sound becoming more urgent, more frantic, and it drove them on, further into the woods. The trees around them grew thicker as they moved deeper into the forest. The ground beneath their feet turned soft and wet, the mud sucking at their boots as they tried to move faster. The screams became louder, but there was something wrong about them. They weren't just desperate. They were distorted, as if the voice was being twisted by the wind, stretched and pulled in unnatural ways. The sounds seemed to echo from all directions, bouncing off the trees, filling the forest with a cacophony of cries. Eric stumbled, almost falling into the mud. "We're not going the right way," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "This doesn't feel right." Mark pushed forward, ignoring the uncertainty in Eric's voice. "We have to keep going," he urged, his voice tight. "She's close. I know she's close." But as they pushed deeper into the woods, the sounds of the forest seemed to shift. The wind picked up again, whipping through the branches, but now it carried with it a strange, almost unnatural whisper, like voices carried on the breeze. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was something else, something alive. The air felt thick, charged with a growing sense of dread. The trees no longer seemed like trees. They were shapes, dark and twisted, their branches like fingers reaching out to grab them. It was as though the forest itself had come alive, watching them, listening to them, guiding them into the darkness. Then suddenly the scream stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It pressed down on them, suffocating, as though the very air had been drained from the world. Mark stopped in his tracks, his chest tight, his breathing shallow. "What's happening? Where did she go?" Jenna scanned the trees around them, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't right. This doesn't make sense." And then in the stillness they heard it. A sound, slow and deliberate, echoing through the trees. Footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic, like someone, or something, was walking toward them. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end, and he felt his blood run cold. It wasn't their friend. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. Jenna looked at him, her face pale. "We need to get out of here." No. But Mark didn't move. He couldn't. He couldn't take his eyes off the shadows in front of them, the dark outline of something moving between the trees. It was getting closer, but it wasn't making a sound, no footfalls, no rustling leaves. It was as if it was gliding toward them, a presence without a form. And then, in the flickering light of their flashlights, it appeared. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form shifting in and out of focus, as if it were made of shadows themselves. The air around it seemed to warp, bending and twisting with its presence. For a moment, Mark thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, but the others saw it too. It was real. It was here. And it was not human. The figure stopped just a few feet away from them, its head tilted as if studying them. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting a sickly glow on its form. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were dark hollows, deep and endless. There was no expression on its face, no emotion, only a deep, profound emptiness that seemed to suck the light from the world around it. Mark took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest, but his legs wouldn't move. He felt frozen, trapped in place, as though the air itself had become thick with something foul, something ancient. The creature, or whatever it was, didn't move. It just stood there, watching them with those dark, hollow eyes, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their shallow breaths. They were all too scared to speak, too scared to move. And then, as if it had lost interest in them, the creature turned, its movements unnatural, jerking in ways that made Mark's stomach twist. It began to walk away, its form melting back into the darkness of the trees. "Run," Eric whispered urgently. "Run now." And for the first time since they'd entered the forest, they turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in on them as they ran, the trees bending in unnatural ways, their branches twisting like the fingers of unseen hands trying to grab them, to pull them back into the darkness. Every step they took felt heavier, the ground beneath their feet soft with mud, making it harder to gain traction. The rain was relentless, pouring down in torrents, soaking their clothes, but the cold was nothing compared to the icy dread settling in the pit of their stomachs. They weren't just running from the creature, they were running from something older, something deeper, something that had been waiting for them in these woods long before they had ever set foot on the trail. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, and he could barely catch his breath as he pushed forward, ignoring the burning in his legs, the stitch in his side. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know where they were going. They were lost. They were all lost. And worse, they were being followed. He could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, keeping pace with them through the trees. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It wasn't even the sound of a human running. It was something else, something that didn't belong. Something that moved with an unnatural, jerking motion, its presence twisting the very air around them. Jenna was just ahead of him, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could see the fear in her eyes as she glanced over her shoulder, but she didn't stop running. They couldn't stop running. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, the flashlight in Mark's hand flickering wildly as if it too was trying to escape the terror that was chasing them. But despite the light, the forest around them remained impenetrable, a sea of black trees and shadows that swallowed up everything in its path. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, and Mark's foot caught on something, an exposed root, a fallen branch, and before he knew it, he was tumbling forward, crashing to the ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, its beam cutting a strange arc through the air before landing in the mud a few feet away. He grunted as his body hit the wet ground, pain shooting through his side, but there was no time to recover. He could hear the thing, whatever it was, getting closer. Its footsteps were louder now, closer, and Mark scrambled to his feet, his hands slick with rainwater, his mind a blur of panic and adrenaline. "Mark!" Jenna screamed from ahead, her voice a thread of desperation. "Come on, get up." But he couldn't answer. He couldn't think. The world around him felt like it was spinning. The trees, those dark, twisted trees, loomed over him like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out in all directions, blocking any chance of escape. Mark didn't know which way to run. He didn't know where to go. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds, but that footstep, it was still there. That rhythmic, deliberate sound, echoing through the forest. It was getting closer. He grabbed his flashlight, fumbling for a grip, and stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He couldn't hear anything but the blood rushing through his head, but he knew that the thing was behind him. He didn't need to see it to know that it was coming for him. "Go!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "We have to keep moving." Jenna turned back, her face a mask of terror, but she didn't stop. She ran, pushing through the rain and the mud, as though the forest itself was trying to drag her down into its depths. Mark followed her, his feet slipping and sliding on the slick ground, but still he couldn't outrun the feeling of something closing in on them. The sound of the footsteps, slow and steady, never wavering, seemed to surround them, coming from every direction. No matter how fast they ran, it was always there, always getting closer. Then there was a cry, high-pitched, desperate, a scream that split the air. It wasn't Jenna. It wasn't Eric. Mark's stomach dropped as he realized it was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Someone else was out there. Another victim. Someone else had wandered into the forest and made the same mistake they had. The same mistake they were still making. The scream died quickly, but the silence that followed was even worse. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears, thick with the weight of something unnatural. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned, his eyes wide in panic. He didn't dare look back to see if the creature was still behind him. He could feel its presence even without seeing it, an oppressive, suffocating weight that seemed to press on his chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. He glanced to his right and saw Eric, struggling to keep up, his face pale and drenched with rain. His expression was one of pure fear, and Mark knew that it wasn't just the storm that was scaring him. It wasn't just the darkness. It was something much worse. Mark reached out, grabbing Eric's arm, pulling him forward. "Come on, we have to move faster." Eric didn't respond. He just nodded and kept running, his eyes darting back toward the trees behind them, as if he expected something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The forest had become a labyrinth, a maze of dark paths and shifting shadows. The trees were so thick now, their trunks so wide, that the path ahead was barely visible. They were running blind, but they couldn't stop. If they stopped, if they slowed down for even a second, they knew they wouldn't make it. "Where are we going?" Jenna's voice cracked as she looked around, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Mark answered, his voice tight. "We just need to get out of here." But the forest wasn't letting them leave. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows darker, and the ground softer, more treacherous with each step they took. The sound of footsteps behind them was growing louder, closer, until it was almost deafening. Mark's mind screamed at him to keep running, to not look back, but his body felt like it was shutting down. His legs were burning, his chest aching with each breath, and the sound of the creature, whatever it was all around him now, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. And then he saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a silhouette that seemed to emerge from the very darkness of the forest itself. But as it stepped into the moonlight, Mark could make out the twisted form, the impossibly long limbs, the hollow eyes. Its body seemed to bend unnaturally, jerking with each step as it moved toward them. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, its feet barely touching the ground as it moved through the trees with an unsettling, unnatural grace. Jenna screamed, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. They were too close. They couldn't outrun it. It was faster than they were, and it was right behind them. "Keep moving," Eric yelled, grabbing Jenna's arm and pulling her forward. Mark stumbled, his foot catching on another root, and he nearly fell again. The forest was closing in, and he couldn't breathe. The creature, no, the thing was right there, and it was moving too fast, too smoothly, its eyes fixed on them with an unblinking gaze. Mark's blood ran cold as it reached out, its long fingers stretching, just a moment away from touching him. They were done for. But then, as if by some miracle, there was a break in the trees ahead. A clearing, faintly visible through the rain-soaked darkness. "Go!" Mark shouted, his voice a desperate, frantic command. Without thinking, without hesitation, they bolted toward the clearing, their legs pumping, the creature's footsteps echoing behind them, growing louder and louder. The clearing was a brief moment of relief, a temporary escape from the oppressive darkness that had swallowed the forest. But as the group emerged into the open space, the sense of relief was short-lived. The clearing was not a safe haven, it was a trap. The air felt colder here, the wind howling through the trees with an almost unnatural force. The ground beneath their feet was still damp, but it seemed firmer here, more stable, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The trees on the edge of the clearing were tall, their bark dark and twisted, but there was something wrong with them. They seemed to bend toward the center of the clearing, like spectators watching something they shouldn't. Mark's heart raced as he slowed his pace, trying to catch his breath. His legs burned, his chest tight with the effort of running, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Creature, whatever it was still behind them, still out there. He could feel it, lurking in the darkness just beyond the edge of the clearing. It wasn't gone. It was still hunting them. Jenna, her face pale and covered in rainwater, glanced around frantically, her eyes wide with terror. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She seemed to be searching for something, anything, familiar, but there was nothing here. The clearing was empty, save for the strange trees, their twisted shapes towering above them like silent giants. Eric, still gasping for air, turned to face the others, his face pale and drawn. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice tight. "We can't stay here." But Mark wasn't so sure. The clearing felt wrong, too quiet, too still. It was as if they were standing on the edge of something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far darker than they could understand. The wind howled again, louder this time, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw something shift in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, something large, moving just out of sight. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively took a step back, closer to Jenna and Eric. "Mark!" Jenna's voice broke through his thoughts, her eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" He shook his head, unable to put it into words. It was like the air around them was thickening, like the world was slowly pressing in, closing in on them. His skin crawled, and he felt a cold sweat trickle down his back, despite the rain that was still coming down in torrents. The wind was picking up again, swirling around them, tugging at their clothes, pulling them toward the trees that surrounded the clearing. It was as though the forest was alive, watching them, pulling them deeper into its grasp. "We can't stay here," Eric repeated, his voice becoming more frantic. "We need to find a way out." No. But there was no clear way out. The trees around the clearing seemed to stretch on forever, their twisted trunks and dark branches blocking any path that might have led them to safety. Mark's mind raced as he searched the clearing for some kind of escape, some sign of a way out, but there was nothing. It was just more trees, more shadows, and the dark presence that still hung in the air, suffocating them. Then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, like a tremor, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The earth rumbled, the trees creaking as though they were groaning under some invisible weight. Mark stumbled, his foot slipping on the wet ground, and he caught himself on a nearby tree to avoid falling. But the ground beneath him continued to shake, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. "Do you feel that?" Eric asked, his voice tight with fear. "What is happening?" Jenna's eyes were wide, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she looked around, panic setting in. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "We need to leave." No. But it was too late. The shaking intensified, and the trees around the clearing began to sway, their trunks twisting unnaturally, as if they were being pulled by some unseen force. Mark's pulse raced as the ground beneath him cracked, large fissures opening up in the earth. He stumbled again, this time falling to his knees, but there was no time to recover. The shaking was getting worse, and the trees were bending farther, their branches reaching toward them like claws. "Move!" Mark shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. "We need to get out of here." They didn't need any more encouragement. The three of them turned and began running again, their feet slipping on the wet earth as they tried to get away from the center of the clearing. The ground continued to shake beneath them, and the trees seemed to be closing in, the branches stretching out, blocking their way. Every direction they turned led to more twisted trees, more darkness. It was as though the forest itself had become a maze, trapping them in its depths. But the shaking wasn't the only thing they had to worry about. In the distance, beyond the trees, Mark could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the forest. It was the creature. It was still following them, still hunting them. "Faster!" Jenna screamed, her voice high with panic. "It's getting closer." Mark didn't need to be told twice. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he pushed himself harder, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the footsteps was growing louder, but they were still too far behind. They had to get out of the forest. They had to find a way to escape before it was too late. As they ran, the air around them seemed to thicken even more, pressing against their skin, suffocating them. It felt like the forest was alive, like it was fighting them, trying to keep them there. The branches above them cracked and groaned, and the ground beneath them seemed to buckle with every step they took. Mark's mind was spinning, his thoughts jumbled with fear and exhaustion. He couldn't think clearly anymore. He just needed to keep running. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mark saw something, a flicker of movement between the trees. It was too quick to be human, too fast. Something was out there, something just beyond the reach of their light. His heart skipped a beat as he felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. "Did you see that?" Mark gasped, his voice shaking with fear. "What?" Jenna's voice was full of panic as she looked around, her eyes darting in every direction. "What was that?" "I don't know," Mark said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But we need to keep moving." The footsteps, those heavy, rhythmic steps, were growing closer again. Mark could feel the creature's presence in the air, closing in on them with every step they took. His breath came faster, his lungs burning with every inhale. But even though the creature was getting closer, something else was happening, something far worse. The ground beneath them began to crack, the earth opening up in wide fissures, swallowing the light. The trees around them shook violently, their trunks bending as though they were being pulled by some unseen force. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the branches as if the forest itself was alive, a living, breathing entity, angry and vengeful. "We can't outrun it," Eric said, his voice trembling with the realization that they were trapped. "We're not going to make it." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. The fear in his chest was too much to bear. The forest had them now, and there was no way out. The creature was close, and the forest was closing in. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The only thing left was to face whatever it was that was hunting them. And as the ground trembled beneath them, and the shadows deepened, Mark realized with a sickening certainty that they were no longer just lost in the woods. They were part of the woods now. And whatever was hunting them was not going to let them leave. The darkness seemed to grow deeper with each passing moment, as if the very night itself was tightening its grip around them. Mark could barely make out the shape of Jenna ahead of him, her figure barely visible in the faint light of their flashlights. The rain had slowed to a constant drizzle, and the only sound now was the quiet rustling of the trees above them, the occasional crack of a branch snapping under the weight of the storm. The air was thick with tension, the silence oppressive, almost suffocating. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, each beat loud and erratic in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the forest wasn't just a passive backdrop to their flight. It was alive, watching them, anticipating their every move. Behind him, he heard Eric's breath come in sharp, quick gasps, his footsteps faltering on the slick ground. Mark didn't dare to look back. He couldn't. If he stopped to check on Eric, if he acknowledged the terrifying reality that they might not make it out, He knew he wouldn't be able to keep going. So he pushed forward, his feet slipping in the mud, his legs aching, but he didn't dare stop. And then, just as suddenly as the moment of stillness had descended on them, the forest shifted. Mark felt it before he heard it, a strange, low vibration that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet. At first, he thought it was just the forest reacting to the storm, to the rain and the wind, but then it grew stronger, more intense. The air itself seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, like the forest was vibrating with a force far older, far more malevolent than anything they had encountered. He felt it deep in his chest, a sensation like his heart was trying to beat its way out of his body. It was the kind of pressure you feel just before something catastrophic happens, the kind of pressure that makes your skin crawl and your breath freeze in your lungs. Did you feel that? Eric's voice broke through the silence, raw and trembling with fear. Mark didn't respond. He couldn't find the words. His pulse raced and his throat went dry. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on them, a suffocating, unrelenting force that was slowly closing in. He glanced to his left, his eyes desperately searching for some sign of hope, some break in the trees that might offer them an escape, but all he saw were the dark, twisting trunks and branches that stretched into the abyss, an unbroken wall of shadows. "Keep moving!" Mark barked, his voice sharp with panic. "We need to keep moving now." Jenna was already ahead, but she stopped abruptly, her body rigid. Her face, illuminated by the flickering flashlight, was a mask of terror. "Mark, look," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Slowly, he turned to follow her gaze, his stomach sinking with dread. There, just beyond the tree line, a shadow moved. It was tall. Too tall. Taller than anything a human could be. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, slithering between the trunks of the trees, a shape that seemed to shift and twist with each movement. Mark's eyes went wide, his body frozen with horror. Creature, whatever it was, wasn't just behind them anymore. It had closed in. It was right there, just a few yards away, and it was watching them. He could feel its eyes on him, even though he couldn't see them. "Go!" he shouted, his voice breaking through the paralysis that had overtaken him. "Move now!" But the creature didn't move. It just stood there, its form impossible to define, as though it was part of the forest itself, an extension of the trees, the shadows. It was as if the darkness had taken on a life of its own and was now stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The air around it seemed to warp and twist, distorting everything within its reach, and for a brief moment, Mark wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. But the terror in his gut told him otherwise. This was real. It was coming for them. Jenna screamed, the sound of it high and panicked, and that was the last thing Mark needed to hear. It was the sound of someone breaking, someone who had reached the end of their rope, and in that moment, Mark realized just how close they were to the edge. To the point of no return. The creature seemed to react to her scream. It moved, but not in any way that Mark could have expected. It didn't lunge or charge at them. It simply slid forward, its form stretching and contracting, like it was floating through the air. There was no sound, no rustling of leaves, no footsteps. It just moved. "Run!" Mark yelled again, this time with more force, more urgency. "Run!" He didn't care where they were going now. There was no more logic, no more reasoning. They just needed to get away. They had to escape. But as he turned to flee, the ground beneath them seemed to betray them. The earth shuddered again, this time with more force, and Mark stumbled as a section of the forest floor cracked open beneath his feet. He barely managed to keep his balance as the trees around them swayed violently, their roots creaking and groaning under the strain. The forest was alive with an unnatural energy, and Mark felt as if the very earth was conspiring against them. The creature was no longer moving alone. It had companions now, shadows that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, darting between the trees like a gathering storm. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he pushed himself harder, but it didn't matter. The shadows were everywhere now. They were closing in, weaving between the trees, circling them. The air was thick with a suffocating presence, like a blanket of doom, and the deeper they ran into the forest, the harder it was to breathe, to think, to move. Jenna stumbled ahead of him, her flashlight flickering wildly, casting erratic beams of light that only seemed to illuminate more shadows. Mark reached out, grabbing her arm, pulling her forward. But before he could speak, before he could reassure her that they were close, that they would make it, the ground beneath them cracked once again. This time, it wasn't just a minor tremor. The earth split open in front of them, a deep chasm that seemed to stretch forever into the darkness. The sound of it was deafening, like thunder echoing through the forest, and for a split second, Mark feared that the entire forest was going to collapse into the abyss. Without thinking, he pulled Jenna back, just in time to avoid falling into the chasm. Eric, who had been running alongside them, let out a yelp as he stumbled, but he managed to regain his balance and pull away from the edge of the gap. "We have to get across," Mark shouted. "There has to be a way." But there was no time to think. The shadows were closing in faster now, no longer just lurking at the edges of the trees. They were moving toward them, not with the slow, deliberate pace of the creature that had been stalking them before, but with speed and purpose, like they were hunting in packs. Mark felt the pressure on his chest intensify, like the forest itself was pressing against him, suffocating him. A sharp crack rang through the air, followed by a low growl, a sound that sent ice through Mark's veins. It was the creature. And this time, it wasn't alone. The shadows were not just waiting anymore. They were moving toward him, toward all of them, and with every second, they were closing in. They were surrounded. "Jenna, Eric," Mark shouted, his voice hoarse, panicked. "We need to jump." Without thinking, he sprinted toward the gap, the ground shaking beneath him as the shadows grew closer. The creature was still watching, waiting, its presence filling the space between the trees like a storm, and as Mark reached the edge of the chasm, he could feel the force of it, the pull of something far darker than he could understand. He didn't know what was on the other side, but he knew one thing for certain: staying here, in this suffocating dark, was not an option. With a single, desperate breath, Mark leaped into the unknown. The world around Mark seemed to stretch, to blur, as he sailed through the air, his body suspended in a moment of sheer terror. The chasm loomed beneath him, dark and gaping, the edges jagged like the teeth of some monstrous creature waiting to swallow him whole. He could feel the wind rush past him, the cold bite of it cutting through his soaked clothing, but his mind was too consumed by the deafening roar of his own heartbeat to focus on anything else. There was only the drop, only the terrifying space between him and whatever lay on the other side. For a split second, he thought he might make it. He thought that maybe, just maybe, he would land on the other side of the chasm and find himself on solid ground again, away from the suffocating grip of the forest, away from whatever hunted them. But as the seconds stretched on, Mark realized that the distance was greater than he had first thought. His stomach lurched, his legs ached with the instinct to brace for impact, but he knew there was nothing he could do now except wait. And then, just as the ground seemed to rise to meet him, his body crashed down hard onto something sharp, something jagged, and for a brief moment, everything went black. Unimaginable pain. Mark gasped as the world rushed back into focus, his body screaming in protest against the impact. His right leg had twisted unnaturally beneath him, and a sharp, searing pain shot up his spine. He felt as if he might lose consciousness, but the force of his own panic kept him awake, kept him alert. He gritted his teeth and tried to push through the pain, his hand reaching instinctively for his leg, but the movement sent another jolt of agony through his body. He bit back a cry, forcing himself to focus. He had to get up. He had to move. Behind him, there was a faint sound, a rustling of leaves, a low growl that sent a chill straight through his bones. The shadows were closer now. He could feel them, pressing in on him from all sides, the darkness growing thicker with each passing second. Mark's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, the terror rising in his chest as he realized that, despite his desperate leap, he had not escaped. He was still in the woods, still trapped. The forest seemed to be alive with noise, the wind howling through the trees, the distant crash of thunder in the sky, but all Mark could hear clearly was the faintest of footsteps, echoing from behind him, each one growing louder, more deliberate. It was coming. The creature, the thing that had stalked them for so long, was closing in. It wasn't just hunting them anymore. It was playing with them. He forced himself to sit up, his hands trembling as he pushed himself against the ground, trying to get some leverage to stand. His leg throbbed with every movement, but he ignored it, focusing only on the task at hand. He had to keep moving. He had to get out of here. But the forest wasn't going to let him. The trees around him seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like hands, grabbing, pulling as if they were trying to keep him in place. The path ahead was dark, uncertain, but it was the only way out. He had to get to it. Mark's breath was ragged now, his chest tightening with each inhale, and he could feel the cold sweat on his skin as he pushed himself to his feet, limping slightly as he moved forward. Each step was an agony, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. And then, just as he thought he might make it, just as he thought he might have a chance, the creature's presence filled the air like a weight, pressing down on him. He didn't need to see it to know it was there. He could feel it, the suffocating presence of something ancient and malevolent that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for this moment. His body froze, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the whispers of the forest around him. The trees seemed to shift, to twist, as if they were moving closer, their trunks bending toward him, their branches creeping down toward the ground like the fingers of some horrific giant. It was here. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. His body was locked in place, frozen in fear, and he could feel the thing, the creature, moving closer, closing the distance between them. He could hear it now, the soft scrape of its unnatural movements through the forest, its breath coming in slow, deliberate puffs. It was toying with him, letting him think he might escape, letting him feel just enough hope to keep him going. But there was no hope. The air around him seemed to thicken, becoming heavier with each passing moment. The weight of it pressed down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, as if it were somehow connected to the creature stalking him. The whispers of the forest, those low, indistinct murmurs that had been present all along, grew louder, swirling around him like a storm of voices, voices that didn't belong in the world of the living. And then the shadows moved. Mark couldn't see it at first, couldn't make out the shape in the darkness, but he felt it. A cold presence, creeping through the trees, surrounding him. The darkness itself seemed to bend, to twist, as the creature, no, the thing, emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form thin and spindly, its limbs stretching far beyond the bounds of what a human could be. Its body was an impossibility, flickering between solid and shadow, a warped reflection of reality itself. Mark couldn't move. His mind raced, but it was like his body refused to obey him. He was paralyzed, his gaze fixed on the thing before him. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow, empty, endless black voids that seemed to suck the light from the world around them. They were eyes that didn't belong, eyes that didn't see, but they were watching him, studying him. The creature's mouth, if it could even be called a mouth, twisted into a grotesque, unnerving smile, the skin around it pulling back like the edges of a wound. It was mocking him, reveling in the fear it had instilled. And as it stepped closer, its feet, no, its form, moved unnaturally, jerking as though it were being pulled by strings, its body contorting in ways that no human could ever move. Every movement it made was an affront to nature, a violation of reality. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't even a sound. It was a feeling, a presence that invaded Mark's mind, pressing into his skull, as if the words were being carved into his thoughts by an invisible hand. You cannot escape. The voice reverberated through the air, not just in his ears but deep inside his soul. You are mine. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the words settled over him, wrapping around his chest like a vice. The terror he had been running from, the fear that had been gnawing at him for hours, suddenly felt so small, so insignificant in the face of this thing. This creature. This thing that wasn't bound by any law of nature, any concept of reality. It was above all of that.